Shabbat Shalom. So you may have heard me say before, I try to make it a point in my sermons to focus on the parts of the Torah that we read, or actually read as part of the triennial cycle. And I do this for several reasons, philosophical and practical. Philosophically, I think it's important to engage with the words of Torah that we actually chanted. And on a practical side, it forces me to look at parts of the Torah that might otherwise be ignored if I instead looked at other, perhaps more well-known, more meaty sections of the Parsha that were not part of our triennial that year. So, for example, since today is the first year of the cycle reading the double Parsha of Chukat-Balak, we did not read the famous scene with Bilam and the talking donkey. So I'm going to have to focus on a different aspect. I need to focus on a different aspect of the Torah. That's for you. Another practical advantage is it prevents me from repeating myself. With the triennial reading, we generally don't read the same sections every year, although there are some exceptions, which I'll get into in a moment. So even if I might want to recycle my previous sermons by sticking to the triennial text, I can't. Until today. Because this day, is the third anniversary of me becoming your rabbi educator, and the first sermon that I gave here, although here was our homes and we were connected by Zoom, and you may remember I was in that green room in Livermore. The first sermon I gave here was, in fact, for the first year of a triennial reading for the double portion of Chukat-Balak, what we read today. And because last year, Chukat and Balak were read separately, the third year's reading of Chukat by itself includes what we read today in the first reading of Chukat-Balak together. So what I talked about last year is also fair game. So I went back and I looked at what I wrote in July of 2020 and July of 2022 to see where I was, to see where we were at that time, and see if there are parts of that message, those messages that are still relevant today. And it's a lot easier to cut and paste text than type it. I think I did find some lessons that we could use today. 3 years ago, I focused on the rod that Moses used to strike the rock to bring water to the people, even though God had told him to speak to the rock. And I pointed out that 40 years earlier, God had commanded Moses to strike a rock to bring out water. But now, before this new generation of Israelites, God commanded Moses to speak to the rock. Although the problem was similar to an earlier problem, the solution needed to be different. But still, God told Moses in this case to bring the rod with him when he was to speak to the rock, which I suggested 3 years ago might not have been God setting up Moses to fail. It might not have been a setup, but rather a test to explicitly show everyone that the old paradigm needed changing. Moses, however, was stuck in the old ways, and striking the rock with a rod does at first seem to work. The water does come out, but it is this act, this one act, that dooms Moses not to enter the promised land, and I think it's fitting. You might wonder, why was it this one? But it shows that he is not able to adapt to the changing situation. He is not able to move into the new paradigm, and so he remains stuck in the desert. Last year, I focused on snakes, looking at why the snakes were the punishment for the people complaining about the lack of food and the manna, and why Moses making a bronze snake would then be an effective cure. The people were frustrated at having to turn back from the land to avoid the armies of Edom. And in their frustration, the manna, the sign of their dependence on God, was transformed from a miracle to a thing that they despised. This frustration and despair was a poison worse than any snake bite, as it takes the wonder and the miraculous that is all around us and transforms it into something lifeless and painful. The bronze snake that God then tells Moses to make is a cure because it directs our eyes and our hearts upward, back towards the heavens and God. One thing I did not mention last year about the bronze snake is many years later, during the reign of King Hezekiah, Hezekiah destroyed it because at that time people were making sacrifices to it. What had originally been this indexical, this thing pointing beyond itself towards God, had become an object of idolatry. And so King Hezekiah, in his religious reforms, destroys the bronze snake that Moses made at God's command. And that was the right decision at that time. So taken together, we see the rod and the snake are tools. And like any tool, they are morally neutral. They can be used for good, they can be used for ill. It depends on the context. It takes a lot of wisdom to know when a tool is helping and when it is holding us back, or worse. Just because something is useful in the past does not necessarily mean that it will be needed in the future. I think that is a relevant message for us today. The Israelites in this parsha are experiencing a change in leadership. Miriam dies, Aaron dies, and Moses is told he will not be leading the people during the next stage of their journey. So too, we are in the middle of a transition of leadership. And the Israelites were on the cusp of a major transformation, from being a people wandering in the desert to a people ready to conquer and settle the promised land. And in the midst of this change, the symbols and tools that the people had been using during their wanderings took on new uses and new meanings. The rod was no longer the way to get water. Words were. And the manna that had sustained the people in their eyes suddenly became a symbol of how they were still not independent people in their own land. And God instructs Moses to make a bronze serpent to show that a change in perspective is enough to change everything. This is a lesson for us in this critical moment filled with uncertainty. We are changing. This is the first Shabbat service where masks are optional. And in the discussions leading up to this decision, it was clear that this tool and symbol of life during COVID had taken on different meanings for different members. I pray that we can navigate these transitions safely and with sensitivity and respect for all. Because in the end, these things, the rod, the serpent, the masks, there are many more, they're all symbols. We can focus on these things because they're tangible, but ultimately they are symbols of something much deeper, because they're all asking us some important questions. Where are we coming from? Where are we going? Who are we? And who do we want to be? And to get there, to get to who we want to be, what must we hold on to? And what must we let go of, even if it was helpful in the past? So in this time of transition, I pray we find the wisdom to answer these questions together. Shabbat Shalom. We continue.